So when I tell folks that I'm a grief and trauma therapist, one of two things usually happens. One, they usually tell me all of their stuff. Or they stop making eye contact because if somehow looking at me, I just magically know. So the good news is that although I am a therapist, I'm not your therapist, and I'm kind of off the clock today. I'm going to put my researcher hat on, and I want to say a bold statement, a hypothesis, if you will, and I want you to help me test it. Why? Will you help me do that? Yes. Every single person in this room has experienced a loss. Raise your hand, just slightly, if over the past 2 years you've uttered a phrase or any variation of the phrase that sounds like BC, you know, before COVID. Maybe you're talking about something that you used to do and you said it happened before COVID. Somewhere you used to go, and it was before COVID. So you're making a distinction between what your life is like now and what it was like before COVID. How many of y'all remember what you were doing and where you were when you realized that COVID was changing your life in some way? Maybe it changed your job, or if you had a job. It changed how you attended or taught your class. Whether you could travel, people watch, right? It changed whether you could mosey into your favorite restaurant and just sit at the table and eat. For some of us, it also meant that we had a loved one that went to the hospital and we couldn't go behind those doors. There was no one standing at that bedside as maybe they took their last breath. Our lives were fundamentally changed. They are still changed. Yes? So you raised your hand just a little bit. In the Greek world, those are losses. Physical or symbolic losses. They trigger the same grief response. Physical losses we recognize. Our society even has rituals and support systems around them. They look like the death of a loved one or someone that you know, or the loss of a limb, or the physical loss of a home. We honor them in some way. Symbolic losses are intangible in nature. They often go unnamed, and that means we very rarely honor them. But these are the ones that accumulate. They happen on a day-to-day basis. They look like the loss of your identity. I worked with a mom who was the parent of a single child. That child died, and the question that burned in her heart, that wouldn't let her rest, was, am I still a mom? Maybe it was the loss of stability, the loss of safety, the loss of normality, the loss of relationships, whether it's a friendship or a marriage or a one that you thought you would have the opportunity to grow. We also lost community. Some of us experience both physical and symbolic losses. Right? And what did we do with that? Some of us were left with the uncomfortable experience of being stuck with ourselves for the first time, because gone were the distractions of extracurriculars, of commuting, of happy hours, of things that kept us busy, that kept us distracted from being still, seen, and present in our own lives. We busy our way through grief. We busy our way through life. And when we experience a loss, we just want to get through it. We want to get back to normal, a normal that no longer exists. Many of us have heard of the 5 stages of grief. Yeah? And here's what we often assume, is that we go through stage 1 and stage 2, stage 3, and we reach a place of acceptance, but grief isn't linear. And acceptance isn't the goal of grief work. It is a full-body experience that requires your participation, voluntary or involuntary. Grief is also a lifelong experience. And for some of you, that feels comforting because it gives you room, permission even, to be where you are. Experience the full range of your emotions. It gives you room to even revisit the losses that you thought you had put to bed. And for some of you, hearing that grief is a lifelong journey, it feels painful and never-ending and scary. Here's what I've learned in my 15-year career as a grief and trauma therapist, a trauma survivor, but also a poverty disruptor, is that we are uncomfortable with death and dying. grief and sorrow, whether it be our own or bearing witness to the suffering of others. But we do get to be companions. And so I created a model, the ACT R model, and I'm going to teach a part of it to you because we can all be companions. Whether you are a therapist or a healthcare professional or not, we all have the ability to act. And we are faced now with the undeniable fact that grief is about more than death. And so the ACT R model, A is acknowledge, C is companion, T is talk or tool, R, reintegrate and reinvent. Again, the R I'm not going to cover today because I say that for my therapist friends. You need a little bit more training, but all of us can act. Before I tell you more about that model, I need to tell you what grief isn't. Grief is not anchored by time. Time alone won't lessen your grief. Again, it's a full body experience. That milestones, life events, anniversaries, holidays will cause you to re-experience. Grief is also, while it is universal, it's unique to each and every one of us. So even when we have shared losses, the way that I grieve is going to be different than yours. The way that I grieve the loss of my oldest brother, his death, was markedly different than the way my mother grieved the loss of her son. In the summer of 2017, I went home to my hometown in St. Louis, Missouri, where I go every 3 to 4 months. Anything longer than that, and my grandmother would call me and ask me, "Have you lost your home training?" It was a reminder to come home. And I went from what I thought was my normal 10-day vacation. I ended up being there for 42 unplanned days. When I got there, it was very apparent that my grandfather was really sick. The cancer was back, and he had already decided against surgeries and against additional treatment. But he had always lived life on his own, so this would be no different. And so on the first day, I got him to eat, something that my oldest brother told me he hadn't been doing. On the second day, I took him to the hospital, a trip from which he would never return. He spent 10 days in the ICU. You see, my grandpa was my person. So even as a kid, I was his shadow. So if I even thought he was going to leave the house, I grabbed his keys and beat him to the car. He was my person. So when I was in my postmaster's training, learning about grief and loss, I talked to him and learned about death and dying and all the things. And I immediately came home and therapized my grandparents. Got a lot of practice. They entertained my shenanigans. But what we also learned was that the statistic that 100% of us will die also opened up the reality that we have the ability today to prepare our loved ones for that moment in our life when we can't speak for ourselves. What are our wishes? What will we have them do? And so these conversations led me to become the power of attorney for both of my grandparents. It meant in his final days, I was responsible for carrying out the terms of his medical directive. I was his person. And so as I sat next to his bed in the ICU, listening to the beeping sounds of the machine and his labored breathing, there was an overwhelming sense of peace and calm that came over me. But it wasn't really peace. It was my training as a grief and trauma therapist who was used to navigating hospitals and crisis situations kicking in, and I was thankful. I was organized, I was tactical, I was unemotional. I was what he needed me to be as his power of attorney. But my grief journey hadn't started. Back home, my grandmother, see, I learned to be a companion by watching her. She didn't move unless I panicked, so we were okay. Where my mother and my siblings were worried, anxious, and even wailing. They were experiencing anticipatory grief, which is the thing that you experience before the thing actually happens. And in our situation, it was the death thing. I remember walking back into the hospital one afternoon after leaving to allow another family member to come and visit, and my grandfather told me he had asked to be intubated because breathing was becoming increasingly difficult. And I looked at him a little weird because the terms were no artificial treatment, no surgeries, no resuscitations, but see, he was still doing life on his terms. And then the peace actually did show up because I realized that there were no regrets. I knew exactly what he would want me to do because we had talked through scenarios ad nauseum. I also didn't have any regrets because there was nothing left unsaid and undone. I knew exactly who he was to me, and I knew exactly what I meant to him. You see, I tell this story to highlight that grief amplifies. It amplifies the gaps in communication, the gaps in families, the gaps in unmet needs, the gaps in what we thought we had time for, and the gaps in what we just no more. But the other thing that grief highlights is that grief is almost always about love. Sometimes unrequited, but always about love. My grief, again, hadn't yet started. It didn't look like I was grieving yet. But the people who knew me best knew that sometimes grief doesn't show up as sadness and sorrow. Sometimes it shows up as busy and organized and tactical and unemotional. Sometimes it shows up. It's a full body experience, right? It shows up as aches in your body, digestive issues, memory loss, loss of concentration, and so much more. And so we need people who are able to acknowledge the magnitude of the loss that we have encountered. Sometimes we don't say the words, I'm sorry for your loss. We don't bring it up because we're worried that we might remind the griever they've never forgotten. See, grief makes you feel kind of like an infant, right? They're fragile, sometimes they're flailing, and they freak you out. That's exactly what grief feels like, right? But what happens as that toddler, that baby becomes a toddler, you now can pop that thing on your hip and hold it with one hand. You adjust to its weight, right? It's always there, you're aware of the responsibility, but it doesn't leave you. You carry it differently. If you're lucky, you find the gift in the aftermath. And so having folks who will let you talk and tell your story, sometimes over and over and over again, until you can find the meaning, is so important. These are the folks who don't let you hide behind, I'm okay, and they're in a better place. Those are well-intentioned but dishonoring phrases. Storytelling is a wonderfully healing narrative therapy, is what we call it in my world, right? They also need companions, compassionate companions, who don't move you. They allow you to be sad and in your sorrow and in your suffering because they're not afraid to bear witness to your journey. They also, compassionate companions, don't evaluate how well you're grieving. We do this to ourselves, right? I should be better by now. Why is this still bothering me? It is a lifelong journey. They let you do all of these things, and they let you talk before they offer you a tool. One of the final things that my grandfather said to me before he died was that you have done enough. You see, at the time I was a full-time professor, pursuing tenure, writing papers, pursuing research grants, raising 2 kids, building my private practice, among other things. His words released me from the unspoken debt. I was working really hard to make my grandparents proud for all the sacrifices that they made so that I could be the first doctor in any generation in my family. His words released me from that overworking, overscheduled, hyperproductive life that I was living. So the gift wasn't in the loss itself, it was in the life that I was able to claim for myself post-loss, and the companions that I had along the way. And so I ask you, as companions, to commit to bearing witness to the journey, not only for yourself, but for others. And so if you take what we know as a fact, that time is a gift that's unopened by many, how will you spend today? Thank you.